When We Disagree is a show about arguments, how we have them, why we have them, and their impact on our relationships and ourselves. Put a bunch of people who lean slightly liberal in a room to discuss politics, and they might leave much more liberal. This has nothing to do with liberalism. Do the same with conservatives, and they'll leave more conservative. This is called group polarization, the tendency for in-group discussions to amplify initial inclinations. The social psychologist Serge Moscovici discovered that homogeneous groups don't moderate views, they intensify them. This phenomenon turns mild disagreements into extreme conflicts. Group polarization explains why online echo chambers become so toxic. A Facebook group that starts with people mildly concerned about an issue becomes a hotbed of extremism. A subreddit that begins with a gentle criticism evolves into pure hatred. What starts as preference becomes passion, then obsession, then radicalization. The group doesn't create extremists, it reveals and amplifies extremism that was always possible. Family dynamics show group polarization in action. Siblings who individually have minor complaints about their parents get together and work each other up into a genuine furor. Co-workers with slight frustrations about management become revolutionaries over drinks. A friend group that starts with casual gossip escalates into character assassination. Understanding group polarization helps us make better collective decisions if we're mindful of it. Deliberately include diverse voices to counteract echo chamber effects. Assign someone to argue the opposite position, to take the naysayer position. Take breaks to reflect individually before group discussions. And most importantly, recognize when group dynamics are amplifying rather than refining your views. Sometimes the group isn't making you wiser, it's making you more extreme. I'm Michael Lee, Professor of Communication and Director of the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston. Our guest today on When We Disagree is Elizabeth Matto. Elizabeth is the director of the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University and the author, most recently, of To Keep the Republic, Thinking, Talking, and Acting Like a Democratic Citizen. Elizabeth, tell us an argument story.
So first, thanks so much for having me, Mike. Really excited to have this conversation with you. I think I'll start. The argument story I want to offer is a disagreement that I had with a family member that was resolved peacefully. But in many ways, I think is emblematic of ongoing conversations, sometimes difficult conversations I find myself having with family members, sometimes with the public, sometimes with students, sometimes even with myself. It's rooted in I wrote an op-ed for The Hill probably 6 weeks ago about the SAVE Act. And the SAVE Act, for those of you who aren't familiar, is the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. And it basically requires people to provide documentary proof of their citizenship when they're registering to vote in federal elections. For a variety of reasons, I wrote this op-ed expressing concern about the legislation, basically arguing that it was trying to address a problem that didn't quite exist, the burdens it would pose. But anyway, wrote the op-ed, was pleased with it. It was published in The Hill. And as I often do, I texted it to my family member, my brother-in-law, who I have a lovely relationship with. And we always talk politics. We often talk politics. Often we have differing views on politics. And sent it to him just to say, thought you might be interested in reading this. He was very complimentary and said, but don't you think that voting is a privilege? Wouldn't we want to do everything we can to protect the vote? And so we had a couple little this was all via text, a couple back and forths about it. And then you sort of get to the point like, okay, talk to you soon. See you at the next holiday, So in many ways, though, I thought it really represents ongoing conversations, sometimes disagreements, sometimes arguments. I find myself in recently with, is voting a right or is it a privilege? What is citizenship? What's good citizenship? What's bad citizenship? So anyway, that would be the disagreement. It was a peaceful one. It helped that it was on text, via text. But I think it signifies others I've had recently.
Hard to argue with about political theory via text, I imagine, but
True.
Maybe it just keeps a lid on how specific, extensive, or time consuming the argument can
True.
really get, because it's just kind of
True.
superficial by nature of the conversation. But
True.
curious about that key word. Spool out for us right versus privilege in your mind. What is the core of that dispute?
So I think, there's been lots of survey research. Pew Research Center in particular is one I think about, but I use it usually as a launch pad in my classroom about, is voting a right or is it a privilege? Are there certain thresholds one should meet? Should we be thinking about voting in a way that it's this sort of honorific activity that one engages in, where you have to not only meet the because it is so important, because it is so instrumental, elemental in a democracy, it's this elevated act that requires, not just that you're a citizen, but I often feel it comes loaded with other expectations. And I sort of unspool that with my students about expectation that you're well informed, that that you've met certain, I don't know, markers of citizenship, that you almost have to meet these expectations in order to have access to the ballot.
Yeah.
Whereas with the right, it's just you're allowed to vote. You have a constitutional right. You have met all the requirements of voting,
Yeah.
and you should be able to vote in a way that is not unnecessarily burdensome. That it should be accessible. That because you are eligible, you should be able to vote with some ease, with easy access, not prove your worthiness of voting.
Yeah, if we all have, I mean, there's eligibility requirements in this country,
Absolutely.
whether it's age or registration, and if the definition of right is that it's afforded to everybody, regardless of circumstance or proof or meeting some certain benchmark, then aren't we already operating as if voting is a privilege because we restrict it based on legal citizenship or whether you've registered or whether you're 18 or whether you haven't committed a felony and so forth?
Yeah, well, I would say, here's where my work with students is so really informs my feelings about this. In that, I'm here, as you mentioned, at Rutgers University. I'm on the one of the largest campuses, New Brunswick campus, large campus, complicated campus. And when I began working here, I don't think I had any sense of how difficult it was as a young adult, as a college student, to make use of your right to vote, to actually access and enjoy your right to vote. I've lived in the same house for nearly 30 years. I've been registered in the same location. I vote in the same location for the last 25, 30 years. I think I had a much better understanding of how difficult it was for students to vote. And that's just one example. That even though they met all the requirements of voting, they were of legal age. They'd been registered successfully. The boundaries or the hurdles they had to cross in order to actually make use of that vote suggested that you weren't worthy of that, of exercising this right that you had. You were afforded this right, and yet if you don't have the privilege, for example, of being able to register to vote online, which for years in New Jersey you couldn't register to vote online. If you have classes all day, and there wasn't early voting for years and years in New Jersey, there was no early voting, so you couldn't get to the polls ahead of time. It felt as if, even though you had the right to vote, the Constitution gave you the right to vote, you had satisfied all the requirements. It was people had more flexibility in their schedule. People who had the privilege of a really high quality civic education, for example, in high school, who knew all the ins and outs of voter registration and turnout. So yes, you may satisfy all of the fundamental requirements of being able to vote, but it seemed in practice like it was the lucky few who were able to actually make use of that right.
It's such a peculiar discourse around voting now. For years, William F. Buckley wrote editorials in the 50s about kind of education requirements for voting, tacit, if not explicit. You should be able to read, you should be able to name the candidates and know who they are, identify basic policy positions. So setting up very specific kinds of restrictions. On the left, it seems like most people, to really stereotype, have said we want equal and easy access across the board. Both sides seem to agree that we want an educated citizenry who is making decisions in the voting booth. Just a question of whether those should be legally inscribed or just kind of expected and hoped for.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and it's not. I know I know that sort of train of thought from William F. Buckley. A sort of similar argument I know George Will has made in the past is this idea of when people decry the fact that we have lower voter turnout rates than comparable democracies. In the United States, we do have much lower voter turnout rates compared to other democracies. I remember an op-ed he wrote arguing basically, well, then that's a good thing. That suggests that if voter turnout rates, if conditions in the United States were particularly dire, that would drive people to the polls. So that, a modest voter turnout rate is suggestive of things are going okay. People don't feel driven to the polls.
Right. Interesting.
And then, so I would argue, here, it's the political scientist in me is, look at the data. Who is voting and where are the gaps in voting? And there's so much research in political science, academia, the idea that we know that things such as education levels, we know that income levels, we know that these things are, one's resources of time, education, finances, heighten the likelihood that you're going to be voting on election day because it's really complicated in the United States. It's a complicated system in the United States. One of the reasons the U.S. has lower voter turnout rates than comparable democracies is that more often than not, the burden is on the individual to get themselves registered to vote. We know that's changing across the country. More and more more and more states are offering automatic voter registration. But if it's that complicated to navigate, which it is in the United States, and if we know that there's data suggesting gaps in voting, due to education levels, again, it kind of goes back to: are we privileging some rather than others when it comes to access to the ballot? I would say, to your point about Buckley, I've had students often argue. And I push them, of course, because that's my job as a faculty member, is to say, you shouldn't, there are problems with people going into the polls. There should be an expectation that you are well informed, and there should be some sort of threshold of information that one should have. I certainly don't disagree with that. I do want voters to be well informed. I also know your ability to do so varies. Like in New Jersey, sometimes it's very difficult to get information about who's on the ballot, who these candidates are. So is it enough to know, my life was better off when this president was president than it is now? Is that enough information for a voter?
Yeah, it does. It seems that this is such a peculiar debate because it's such a false dichotomy on a few levels, like right versus privilege. Well, even the people who say it's a right would, I assume, say, you should be sober in the voting booth, that 3-year-olds shouldn't be allowed to vote, that we would hope, if not require, that who these people are. And frankly, many of us who vote, especially on the down ballot, for local dog catcher and such, haven't the slightest idea, especially in a nonpartisan election, who the names are. I mean, we're just basically picking horses at the Kentucky Derby because one has a fun name, and whatever name biases we're bringing into the booth. And so that limits against the rights argument, right? But then a lot of the people who say it's a privilege would also extend it really broadly to lots of groups. And so they kind of veer back to the privilege side. And so they seem to collapse in on each other. And then the second one is, for years and years, the kind of lore amongst the left was, the more people who vote from the more demographics, the better chance we'll win. And so maybe there's a moral and ideological case for left types to want more people voting. And so that's why they pushed it. But it also seemed like there was a kind of rooting interest there. Like, if we can just expand this game, maybe we'll win more elections. And then right, of course, the long lore is we'll dirty up the election and make it more restrictive to vote, and we can win these kind of defensive kinds of elections. Then the 2024 election seems to have exploded that, at least the early returns I've seen. And I'm not a political scientist of voting, but I've followed it pretty closely. It does seem like a lot of people from a lot of different interest groups voted. A fairly high turnout election for us. And then, it flipped the narrative of more people voting leads to left wins on its head.
Yeah. And expanding or constricting the voting pool offers all sorts of uncertainty. Right. And so I think it's a red flag for both Republicans and Democrats. It makes it more difficult. And again, I'm speaking a lot about 18 to 22-year-olds, because that's an area I focus on. It's really difficult when you're not certain. If someone doesn't have a voting history, you don't know how likely are they going to be a stable, reliable voter? Who are they voting for? And so there are concerns when it comes to just, opening up the voting pool. You lose control of what you have known. What's been interesting too, and you bring up, the one thing I think in the most recent election, 2024, campaigns are so sophisticated now, and they're so sophisticated at micro-targeting and being able to really target particular voters. And so, even if the voting pool is expanding, I think campaigns are adept, and the Trump presidency was a good example of really reaching out to 18 to 25-year-old young men, right. And really with great success. So I think there is that uncertainty for sure. I think to even broaden it a little bit, I feel sometimes this conversation about, and I don't want to get us on a tangent, it almost is reflective of how do we think of patriotism, different conceptualizations of patriotism, and what does patriotism look like? It almost is similar to this argument. I'm still a big Tocqueville fan, and I'm sort of saddened when I know that students don't read Tocqueville as much as I certainly didn't when I did in undergrad. But he talks a lot about, there is this conversation that he has in his book, Democracy in America. And for people who don't remember the Tocqueville story, Tocqueville was a French aristocrat who traveled the United States in 1820s. Mm-hmm. And interestingly was here looking at the penal system throughout the United States, but found himself really reflecting on democracy and what was it about American democracy, Republican forms of government in particular, lowercase r Republican forms of government, that made them stable. And one thing he points out is he looks at this reflection on what does patriotism mean and the different definitions of patriotism. And one he argues is called instinctive patriotism, sort of that sort of reverential type of patriotism that's rooted in your belief in just customs. You feel a loyalty to where you were born, and this seems simplistic, kind of a waving the flag sort of patriotism, often rooted in symbolism. Mm-hmm. Then he also argues there's a deeper kind of patriotism that he noted in the United States in the early 1800s, that what he argued is more fruitful, more lasting, that's more thoughtful in nature, that often is more willing to complain, willing to criticize, but also more engaged. So much of my work here is about civic engagement and encouraging people to participate in politics. That often, real patriotism is about really linking your personal well-being with the well-being of the country. And often that comes from really being deeply rooted in the workings of government. So I don't know if this is a fair comparison or not, but I often, in these arguments, I find myself in disagreements. Mm-hmm. Not unlike this one about is voting a right or a privilege. It often comes to, what does patriotism look like? Or how do we know when someone is patriotic or not? Again, back to false dichotomies. You can't, it is an unfair dichotomy.
Since we've talked a lot about these and Tocqueville and false dichotomies, and of course, kind of young people and young voters and their participation, whether they're joining up and mm-hmm. acting in groups and participating in a civic way. I'm curious, and this will be our last question, and sort of speculate about where this goes. There was so much discourse ahead of the 24 election, stemming from the 20 election, that, especially amongst the left, that young people are going to save us. The young people are going to come along, and they are just so civically minded. They're so community oriented. They're driven by these social values that are really atypical from the rest of the country. Kind of their brother and sister's keeper kind of people.
Yeah.
And then that seems not to have borne out in any of the data that I have seen from the 24 election. And some of the data from Jonathan Haidt and others suggests that this is a generation, kind of young Gen Z and older Gen Alphas, are motivated more by anxiety, painting with a broad brush, than any previous generation we have on record, and then motivated by money. By making lots of money, saying that making lots of money is really more important than other generations have answered that question at higher percentages. And so we have these two kind of competing ideas. We have this allegedly woke generation who's going to save the left, and then now we have a generation that does not seem to be voting as such. Where do you see, as an expert in these voting patterns, where do you see the youth vote, quote unquote, going in future elections?
Well, I mean, I feel as if there was a window of opportunity that is still there, but it's closing. In that, especially Gen Z, millennials sort of began the trend of having a more sort of public spirited cohort of people. Often looked at, 9/11 being the sort of marker beginning of millennials, where there's sort of the sense of community mindedness, caring about the public, caring about solving problems. Certainly with Gen Z, often you look at the March for Our Lives movement as one indicator, focusing that public mindedness on politics and voting in particular. You have seen periods, upticks of voting. And I think it has been met by frustration. It has been met with disillusionment. I think if there is concern, if there is a amplified emphasis on money, that's because they are looking ahead to shouldering tremendous burdens that previous generations haven't had to shoulder. This is a generation that is inheriting so many problems from previous generations, many of them financial. Will there be a social security system for young adults? How will they pay for student loan debt? How will they ever own a home? Will they ever get married? Will they ever have a savings? So it's not surprising to me that there's both a focus on just financial stability and well-being and a sense of disillusionment with the way government is functioning. So that's not unique to the United States. We are seeing disillusionment with democratic systems around the globe. And it is a great cause for concern. And here is where, and you're a fellow academic, this is where I think education is so critically important in K-12, but in higher education. Recognizing the shortcomings of democracy, recognizing the shortcomings of democratic processes, institutions, but basically arguing it's the best game in town. It is there is a good reason to believe in democracy and to support democracy, but it's not genetic. It's not automatic. Our children, our grandchildren, will not have gotten the same education that previous generations have gotten, will not have gotten the civic education that previous generations have gotten. So I would say, I think there's reason for concern about young adults' willingness, propensity, skill set. However, I think there is still a hunger and a drive if we not only give them the skill set, give them the tools, but give them the opportunity. Give them the opportunity to run for office, to be successful when running for office, to lead movements. So to step aside a little bit also. I think there's a little bit of stepping aside and making room for young adults, but also equipping them.
Elizabeth Matto, thank you so much for being on this episode of what we usually call When We Disagree, but turned into Get Off My Lawn.
Thank you for having me, Mike.
When We Disagree is recorded at the College of Charleston with creator and host Michael Lee. Recording and sound engineering by Jesse Kunz and Lance Laidlaw. Reach out to us at whenwedisagree@gmail.com.